Om Namo Bhagavate Sri Ramana. We'll start with dialogue number 433. Mr. Thomas, Professor of Sanskrit, University of Oxford, had presided over the Oriental Conference in Trivandrum, and on his way to Calcutta, he visited Sri Bhagavan. He is an elderly gentleman with a broad forehead and a quiet manner. He speaks softly and slowly. He evinces great interest in Oriental literature, especially Sanskrit. He had heard of the richness of Tamil. He desired to know which of the English translations of Srimad Bhagavad Gita was the best. The hall was crowded, and a few of them mentioned, with each his own opinion, the Bose, Mahadeva Shastris, Tilangs, etc. Sri Bhagavan made mention of F.T. Brooks. Mr. Thomas desires one in metrical form because it is the proper vehicle for rasa, essence, contained in it. Rasa is also peace, he said. The Maharshi said, yes, Brahman is only rasa. The disciple said, rasa is also bliss. Sri Bhagavan replied, rasa, ananda, peace are all names for the same bliss. The professor was shown Mr. Grant Duff's speech in the philosophical conference held at Paris. Later, the book Dharma by Dr. G.H. Mies was placed in his hands, on seeing which he asked what Sri Bhagavan thought of caste. Sri Bhagavan replied, the castes relate to bodies and not to the self. The self is bliss. To realize bliss, one realizes the self. No need to worry oneself about caste, etc. The disciple said, the ahamkara is also called the self. Sri Bhagavan replied, ahamkara is limited, whereas the self is beyond it. He said Brahman is only rasa. What is rasa? As a word, it has a number of meanings. But in the context of Vedanta, rasa would mean essence. What is the Brahman essence? Is it not existence? Can there be anything more essential than your very existence? The universal, all-pervading essence. That rasa, or essence, is also bliss. Where there is existence, there is ananda, bliss. There is peace. Is there anywhere where existence is not? It cannot be. You would perceive bliss everywhere, peace everywhere, if you knew the essence. It is not the forms that existence appears to be endowed with through false attribution of illusion to the reality. Essence is transcendent. Peace is transcendent. Bliss is transcendent. Whether we refer to it as essence or peace or bliss, these are all terms indicating the same one reality, the same Supreme Self. The Self is bliss, he said. To realize bliss, one realizes the Self. For happiness that is perfectly full and never comes to an end, you must know yourself. Self-knowledge is all important. To know yourself, you must discern the distinction between what is the body and what is the self. What pertains to the body does not pertain to the self. Whatever relates to the body is not your concern. One's concern should be only for the self, to realize it, to know it as it is. The disciple had said, the ahamkara is also called the self. It is the ego, or I notion. Sri Bhagavan instructed, ahamkara is limited, whereas the self is beyond it. Only what is unlimited should be identified as truly being yourself. What has limitation is illusory, and it is not the self. Or we may say, the same I that with limitations appears as the individual, ahamkara, is found to be only the infinite and eternal self when the limitations are abandoned in the recognition that they are just a product of ignorance. Discern what is the body, what is the I, and who are you really? In this is found lasting happiness. This is where your bliss is. The disciple said, "There is much literature in English relating to Eastern philosophy and religion. There are different exponents. The system of Ramanuja is well presented. Professor Radhakrishnan expounds the Advaitic system. He lays more stress on experience than on evidence. Shankara shows a highly developed mind." A discussion followed on direct perception. The professor spoke of mental perception, also as different from sense perception. Sri Bhagavan said, "To infer one's existence, no other evidence is necessary. The indriyas, senses, and the mind arising from the ego cannot serve as evidence relating to the self. The self is their basis. They do not exist independently of the self. One's own existence is self-evident. Bliss is the self. All become dear only owing to the love of the self." The disciple asked, "Love postulates duality. How can the self be the object of love?" Sri Bhagavan responded, "Love is not different from the self. Love of an object is of an inferior order and cannot endure, whereas the self is love. In other words, God is love." The disciple said, "It is also the Christian idea." Upon what does the knowledge of your existence depend? Sri Bhagavan said, "To infer one's existence, no other evidence is necessary." Existence is self-evident. The senses and the mind arising from the ego cannot serve as evidence relating to the self. The knowledge of existence does not depend on sensory perception, nor on mental conception. Without relying upon the senses or the mind, you know your existence. The existence, which is the self, is the reality. Though it is beyond the senses and the mind, the self is their basis, the substrate of existence, apart from which the senses and mind have no existence whatsoever. They do not exist independently of the self. Now he says, one's own existence is self-evident. Knowledge of being is of a self-luminous nature. It does not come from elsewhere. It is not proved by anything else. It is not disproved by anything else. It is quite beyond the range of any proof that could be mentioned. That which is so beyond all is in you, is you. The nature of existence is also bliss. So as one's own existence is self-evident, he says bliss is the self. It is not to be experienced as if it were an object. Bliss is identical with existence. It knows itself. It enjoys itself. To realize this conclusively, one need only inquire to know the self as it is.
Know me? So it knows itself, is that, because it said earlier, discussion followed on direct perception. So that direct perception, is that the self knowing itself? What you're just talking about?
The self knowing itself can alone be considered direct perception. Everything else, so-called, apparently perceived, rises only after the rise of the I notion. What is experienced through the senses can hardly be considered direct. What is thought of in the mind is also indirect. It is not the knowing essence. When the knowing essence knows itself by its own light, that alone is direct perception or true perception. One's own existence is self-evident. Bliss is the self. All become dear only owing to the love of the self. There is existence, which is bliss, which is love. All are loved in whatever form they appear, only due to the bliss of that existence. Such love is actually the indivisible nature of being. But the disciple doubted and said, love postulates duality. How can the self be the object of love? Sri Bhagavan graciously explained, love is not different from the self. Love of an object is of an inferior order and cannot endure. Whereas the self is love. In other words, God is love. Eternal love is true love. What is eternal? What is eternal is the self alone. The self is the peace. The self is the happiness for which one seeks. The self is itself the love for which all yearn. It is the self alone that is dear. The self is love. In other words, God is love. Know your being as it is, and it is supreme. It is God. Such is eternal, and such is the nature, truly, of love. He also asked Sri Bhagavan which of the methods was the best for the attainment of the goal. Is not Patanjali's the best? Sri Bhagavan replied, Yogaschita vritti nirodha. Yoga is to check the mind from changing. The word vritti has been translated as changing. We can say it means a mode or modes. So yoga is to check or restrain the mind from its vrittis, its mode, which is acceptable to all. That is also the goal of all. The method is chosen according to one's own fitness. The goal for all is the same. Yet different names are given to the goal, only to suit the process preliminary to reaching the goal. Bhakti, yoga, jnana are all the same. Swasa rupanasandanam bhaktiriti abhidyate. Self-contemplation is called bhakti. It's a quotation from Vivekachudamani by Shankar. The disciple asked, does Sri Bhagavan advocate Advaita? Sri Bhagavan replies, Dvaita and Advaita are relative terms. They are based on the sense of duality. The self is as it is. There is neither Dvaita nor Advaita. I am that I am. Simple being is the self. The disciple said, "This is not Mayavada, doctrine of illusion." Sri Bhagavan replied, "The mind is Maya. Reality lies beyond the mind. So long as the mind functions, there is duality, Maya, etc. Once it is transcended, the reality shines forth. Although it is said to shine forth, self-effulgence is the self. The question was referring to determining what is the best method, what is the best path. Sri Bhagavan very deftly directs the seeker to look in a deeper way, rather than formulating opinions about paths and such. Quoting the opening verse from Yoga Sutras, he said, "Yoga is to check the mind from changing or from its mode, which is acceptable to all. For without the vritti, without the modes of mind, can you formulate an opinion? What is desired is to be in that which is transcendent of the mind. That is the self, and that is the common goal or aim of all. The method is chosen according to one's own fitness. One's own temperament and inclination will determine the form that one's path takes, what one is drawn toward. Yet different names are given to the goal only to suit the process preliminary to reaching the goal. Bhakti, yoga, jnana are all the same. In the finality, there is no multiplicity, no duality whatsoever. Everything else that appears as if differentiated is merely preliminary in one's practice. When one reaches the goal, no such differences are found to exist. How far off is the goal? Not far at all. It is precisely where you are, where your existence is. Then he quoted Vivekachudamani by Shankar, in which he says, the investigation or inquiry into one's own true nature is bhakti, thus they sang. Translated here as self-contemplation is called bhakti. If that is the definition of bhakti, what is the definition of jnana or of yoga? It can only be the very same as Shankara already uttered. The next question was, does Sri Bhagavan advocate Advaita? Does he advocate non-duality? Sri Bhagavan replied, Dvaita, duality, and Advaita, non-duality, are relative terms. They are based on the sense of duality. So the distinction between duality and non-duality appears only from the position of duality. From the view of non-duality, no such differences exist. What then is real? The self is as it is. It exists. It is existence. Unchangeable existence. Inconceivable, it is as it is. There is neither duality nor non-duality. The thought of either is illusory. To realize such is to stand beyond duality and non-duality. Or we may say it means really abiding in non-duality as it truly is. I am that I am. Simple being is the self. Simple in the sense of a solitary existence that is one without anything other whatsoever. The disciples said, "This is not Mayavada, doctrine of illusion," which apparently he was expecting Sri Bhagavan to represent. Of course, how can one who is beyond all Maya be called a Mayavadan, one who has a doctrine of illusion? Sri Bhagavan once again graciously explains, the mind is Maya, illusion. Reality lies beyond the mind. So long as the mind functions, there is duality, Maya, etc. All such things exist only in the mind. Once it is transcended, that is, once the mind is transcended, the reality shines forth. To be free of the mind, inquire to discern its nature. Who is it that transcends? The mind does not grasp it. The mind is itself transcended. Such being realized, the reality shines forth. It is the self-luminous consciousness. Although it is said to shine forth, self-effulgence is the self. We say the reality shines forth. For whom? As it is eternal, it is always shining forth. As it is truly non-dual, there is no other for whom it would shine forth. It shines in its own light for itself. The light, the realizer, and the realized are all the same one self. The disciple said, "It is sat-chit-ananada." Sri Bhagavan replies, Sat-chit-ananda is said to indicate that the Supreme is not asat, not achit, and not ananda. Because we are in the phenomenal world, we speak of the self as sat-chit-ananda. The disciple said, aham, I, applies to the individual and also to Brahman. It is rather unfortunate. Sri Bhagavan replies, it is upadhi, bheda, owing to different limiting adjuncts. The bodily limitations pertain to the aham, or I, of the jiva, the individual, whereas the universal limitations pertain to the aham, or I, of Brahman. Take off the upadhi, the limiting adjunct. The I, aham, is pure and single. We refer to the self as being of the nature of sat-chit-ananda, being consciousness bliss. What is meant by it, Sri Bhagavan explains, is that the Supreme, that is, the Absolute Self, is different from the unreal, different from what is insentient, different from unhappiness. Such is the meaning of Sat, Chit, and Ananda. Because we're in the phenomenal world, we speak of the self as sat-chit-ananda, being consciousness bliss. But it is not an object. There is no object that is sat. There is no object that is chit. There is no object that is ananda. Sat-chit-ananda referred to something non-objective, which means it cannot be triple. There is a threefold term for one thing. A thing that's not an object, It's different from the unreal, different from the insentient, different from unhappiness. We speak of it as being consciousness bliss, but it is to be known only within the self as it is. The next question had been, aham I applies to the individual and also to Brahman. It is rather unfortunate. Sri Bhagavan explained, it is upadhi bheda, owing to different limiting adjuncts. The bodily limitations pertain to the aham or I of the individual or jiva, whereas the universal limitations, time, space, creation, destruction, etc., pertain to the aham I of Brahman. Take off the upadhi, the limiting adjunct. The I is pure and single, and there is no distinction between Brahman and the Atman, the Self and the Absolute. This is what spiritual practice accomplishes. The removal of the limiting adjunct, which gives rise to difference. The limiting adjuncts are the misidentification. Remove the misidentification, remove the adjunct, the thing added to your nature, an illusion only, that makes you seem as if limited. Remove such, and what remains of I? Only Brahman. The disciple asked, does Bhagavan give Diksha, initiation? Sri Bhagavan replied, Mauna, silence, is the best and the most potent Diksha. That was practiced by Sri Dakshinamurti. Touch, look, etc. are all of a lower order. Silence, Mauna Diksha, changes the hearts of all. There is no guru and no disciple. The ajnani confounds his body with the self, and so he takes the other's body for the guru. But does the guru think his body to be the self? He has transcended the body. There are no differences for him. So the ajnani cannot appreciate the standpoint of the guru and of shishya, disciple. The disciple then asks, is there then no difference between the one and the other? Sri Bhagavan replied, there are differences from the standpoint of the phenomenal world, but not from that of reality. The professor was thankful. He hoped to appreciate Sri Bhagavan's writings better after having seen him and conversed with him. So the question is, does Bhagavan give Diksha? Yes, all of the time. Such Diksha is absolute. It is mauna or silence. He says it's the best and most potent Diksha because it is of the nature of reality. What can be more potent than the reality? That was practiced by Sri Dakshinamurti. He's still practicing now. Touch, look, etc. are all of a lower order because they pertain to the body and to forms, which are ultimately not real. Silence, Mauna Diksha, changes the hearts of all. This is self-evident. There is no guru and no disciple. What then are their nature? To see that, you must perceive what is beyond the body. He said, the ajnani, the ignorant one, confounds his body with the self, and so he takes the other's body for the guru. But does the guru think his body to be the self? He has transcended the body. There are no differences for him. So for the guru, there is no guru and no disciple. There are no differences for him. So the ajnani, the ignorant one, cannot appreciate the standpoint of guru and of shishya. That is what their real nature is. If by the grace of the guru, the ajnani loses his ignorance, so he ceases to be an ignorant one, then he understands. And we can say there is no guru and no disciple. Or put another way, there is only the guru and there is no disciple. It amounts to the same. The last question by the professor was, is there then no difference between the one and the other, between the guru and the shishya? Sri Bhagavan replies, there are differences from the standpoint of the phenomenal world. That is, as long as the world is taken to be existent in any way whatsoever, the differences appear between the guru and the disciple as well. But not from that of reality. the reality is worldless, without a differentiating mind, without limiting adjuncts. The light of all lights, realized in eyeless silence. Om Namo Bhagavate Sri Ramana. Shanti, Shanti.